going to be gradients. Okay. And there's a few different gradients. Here's a conical gradient, which, I think is very beautiful, but in some cases it might not look great. So, you have to play around with canonical gradients to kind of make them look good. Maybe we can search online for some great canonical gradient use cases. And I'll show you how I built this one, which kind of makes it look nice. Okay. And then we have linear gradients, radial gradients. And this crazy one here is we're actually layering multiple gradients on top of each other. It's kind of crazy, right? But it looks really cool. So that's a fun one. And then lastly, this is just an example of how we can, kind of do this animated gradient. I'm doing it on hover here, but you can do it maybe on page load. When the page first loads, you can actually have this gradient load and animate on page load. Really cool stuff. Next is gradients. Okay, there's some cool gradients in here. I need a quiet dog swatch. Yes, I do. My wife got home, so my dogs were excited to see them. Okay, so let's look at some of these. Let's go in order that I have here. So the conical URL or conical gradient. A lot of these swatches have very similar settings. There are 3 different gradient swatches. There is a radial gradient, a conical gradient, and a linear gradient. Okay. So all of them are slightly different settings, but mostly they're going to be very similar. So let's look at the conical gradient. Basically, I added, a class conical. And let's look at the setup here. Actually, let's go to a simpler one. I'm going to actually start off with the linear gradient just because it's definitely a simpler one to look at. And I think most people understand the linear gradient. So, obviously this one, this one I'm doing animated, but, here, this linear gradient right here. Okay. This one is this, linear gradient right here, this blue one. Okay. So this is, grad dash linear. If we look here, the gradient style, we can do just a simple 2-colored gradient, a multicolored gradient, and then layered gradients. Okay, I'm going to use these examples within the gradients, this linear gradient swatch to show you. Okay, so we'll start off with a simple 2-color gradient, which allows you to define a starting color and an ending color. And if you look here, we have the starting color and the ending color. We define the position, so it starts at the top left. Do you want it left middle? It's basically the direction of the gradient. Okay, so this allows you, again, to define the direction the gradient is going. So if I were to do this right top, okay, or let's do some center top, okay, it kind of defines where the position of the gradient is positioned within the element. Okay, next is scale. I'm not going to confuse this with scale. I'm gonna skip that right now. When we do this animated on hover, I'll show you a use case for that. Okay. Let's look at this gradient setup down here. So here we have our 2-color gradient, and then we have the angle at which, and that allows us to define the actual angle. If you look at now, it's angled down, right? So you can change the angle of the gradient. Okay, as you see, it's changing here as I'm changing this angle of the gradient. Okay, next we have, again, start color, ending color. And then you can also define these start, end, and mid allows us to define where the colors start, where they end up in the middle, and where they end. Okay, so you can kind of play. What's kind of cool about these is you can really play with these. And obviously, like having a start after the end gives you a very solid line, which is not what you want most of the time, right? But allows you to define kind of where the colors start. You could play around with these sliders to kind of see, how the color changes. You can adjust the midpoint. Again, you're probably going to want start, end, and mid, to be, not one before the other. They need to be in order. Actually, come to think of it, I should probably have mid in the middle of start and end, to be honest. But anyway. Okay. So that's a simple 2-color gradient. Let's move on to a multicolored gradient. When you click on multicolored gradient, you'll notice that there are other buttons here where you can add an additional 4 colors to your gradient. So this color still starts this the start and ending colors, okay? But then these here allow you to add intermediate colors. And you can add up to 4 intermediate colors. So you can customize the color to be whatever you want. So like if I want purple here, and then I want red, and let's just do 2 for right now. And then we can kind of adjust the positions here. So if we adjust the position of this one to be 50, and this one is there. Here, let's start this one there. There we go. There we kind of get where you can add multiple color gradients and all that kind of jazz. So there we go. I don't think these colors really look like the red is really, really bad. If we were to add something a little different, maybe that meshes more. There we go. Kind of looks a little nicer, right? So you can really add it. And again, you can have up to 6 colors now in a gradient. And then again, you can still provide the angles, even with multi-colors, right? And all that jazz. So really cool stuff. Okay. Next up is layered gradients. And I'm going to review this last, okay? Because layered gradients, essentially you can add as many gradients as you want, and you can stack gradients on top of each other, which is kind of crazy, okay? And I'll show you the example that I've built here in this file. Okay. Let's set this back to where it was. Okay. So that is linear gradient. Now that I've gone through all the options in linear gradient, the other stacks will actually be pretty simple. So let's look at the radial gradient. Same exact options here. We have 2-color, multicolored, and layered gradients. Oh, this is the layered gradient. Do I have a simple radial? Here's the simpler radial gradient. So here I have a 2-color radial gradient. We can still set the size and the position. And if you see here, the options are a little bit different. We can set our shape, whether we want the shape to be elliptical or a circle. And then we can set the origin, which is where the circle starts. So here I set it to 40%. So the circle starts around here. Okay, but you can change that. Like, so if you wanted it to be, let's say 40, 0. Okay, that will then, now if we look at that, that option puts it up here in the middle. Okay, actually, if we set it to like 50%, it would probably be nice because it would be right in the middle, right? And that creates that radial gradient. So the origin allows you to define the origin of the particular shape. Okay, either whether the circle or the ellipse. Okay, and all the other settings are exactly the same as linear gradient. So we could have the start position, the end position. If you wanted multicolors, you can add multiple colors, and you can add all of those just like you could with the linear gradient. Obviously, in this case, it would just be using a radial gradient instead. Okay, next up is the conical gradient. Okay, this is definitely kind of tricky. Okay, because I'm going to set the origin to be 0, 0 on this. Let's preview that. Oh, wait. I'm sorry. I think the default's 50-50 actually. Okay. This is what a conical gradient looks like by default. Okay. It has a really harsh line depending on the colors that you choose. Okay. Which really isn't probably great for a design aesthetic. But if you notice, what I did here is I set the origin to -2 on the y-axis, right? And what that did is that brought that point to be -2 pixels up here. And by doing that, it gave me it gives you a very beautiful like color spectrum here, where it is very interesting, and it kind of hides that point. We still see a little, kind of dip right here where it definitely we see something here, but it's not like that dramatic, that huge ugly line, right? So I think conical gradients can be, when used in this fashion, can be used for very nice subtle gradients that I think really can add depth and some, kind of gives you like a more movement feel, because it looks like it's more natural, right? So I think there's some really great uses. Maybe one day we can maybe on Friday, if you join us at the Hangout on Friday, we can, play around, search the web for some really cool uses for canonical gradients and see how we can integrate those into our designs. Okay. But all the other options are the same as radial gradients. You can add, multi colors. You can add the 2-color. You can even layer them on top of each other. Okay. So that's conical gradients. Next up, let's look at this really cool example of a layered gradient. And so essentially what we do, this is kind of tricky, this example here. Okay. Let's look at what I did. This has 3 colors. The first color goes from red. Okay. It's 80% red to 0% red. Okay, so we go from a transparent red to a fully transparent color. So basically it fades to nothing. Okay, let's go ahead and turn off the first 2 colors. Oops, what did I do here? So let's look at this example here. Okay, this is a radial gradient, by the way. And if we look at this small example here, hopefully you can see that, we're going from red to fully transparent red. Okay, to nothing. Then I'm gonna layer a second gradient on top of that, and on that it's 80% green to transparent. So now I'm filling in this transparent area from this red gradient with the color green, and then I change the origin so that it's down here, and I change the angle. Okay, so this is a radial gradient that's gonna start here and go out. Okay. And then if I add that third color, we're going to fill in this bottom area with the blue. Right? So that allows us, again, and the blue is going from a solid color to fully transparent as well. So that allows all 3 colors at the end of their spectrums to let the other color bleed through. But then, in some parts, those gradients are going to overlap. But because there's opacity, the gradient below it bleeds through and those colors really blend. And you can get a really amazing layered gradient like that. So that is like really beautiful. Like this layered gradient stuff, when I built this, hopefully it's not, I think it's not too complex. I think it's pretty simple concept how I just explained it now, where you add one gradient, you add another, and then we're adding another. And when you have all 3 of them together, it's just like, that's pretty awesome. Okay. And we could do these layered gradients with radial, linear, and conical gradients. Okay. Cool. Okay. Let's look at this animated gradient. So this particular gradient here, if you notice when I hover over, okay, it animates. And essentially what this is doing is we create a gradient, we make it the background that is bigger than the element, and then on hover, we're just moving it back and forth. Okay, so when I unhover, the background, it's like having a background image. You could actually do the same exact animation with an image. Okay, I'm just using a gradient instead. So let's look at that. So here we go. Here is my animated gradient. Okay, it's just a linear gradient. okay, that goes from red to blue. Now, what's key here is I set the position to be right middle. And then if you look at my scale, I make it 200% the width of my container. So I scale the gradient to be 200% the width. Again, that makes it two times bigger than the container that it's inside of. Okay. Then we have a background props swatch. This is a swatch that comes with the swatch pack. Okay. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm changing the position. Remember, the position was right middle. I'm changing the position on hover to be left middle. Okay. So right now on the unhovered state, the position is right middle. Okay. Think of this gradient as just a big image, and we have lined it to the far right. Okay. And then when I hover over it, it's going to want to change that background position to the left side, which contains the red. And essentially and then obviously, if you're familiar with the transitions, we can then animate the background position with the transition swatch, and we define the time. I set it to be 5 seconds. Pretty cool, right? Now, I said earlier you could actually animate this on page load, okay? And that's 100% possible. It'd be hard to do this because this is further down the page, and if I reload this page, it's going to go to the top. But I'll essentially tell you how you would do it. If you hover over this parent class setting, and if you read this tooltip, hopefully everybody reads the tooltips because there's some really cool knowledge in there. And here's a perfect example. If you hover over the parent class option, you'll see that there's a few classes that you can add to this that will be useful. And the first one is loaded. And this is a class that's assigned to the entire web page once the web page has completely loaded. Therefore, if I were just to change this, instead of doing this on hover, if I do loaded, okay, let's preview. Let's see if that's going to work. There we go. Oh, there it goes. Boom. I see on page load, we initially get the gradient on the blue state, and then it animates through. Now, if we wanted maybe a little bit cooler, we can actually add a slight delay on that. So let's add like a 2-second delay. Oops, not 2 milliseconds. We'll add a 2-second delay, and let's preview that. 1,000, 2, 1,000. Boom, animation. Okay. So there we go. That's really cool, right? So if you never knew how you can add stuff, I think the loaded was added, I think, in Foundation 6.7, I think. But that's a very useful thing when you want to apply animations to things on page load. And the animation will only happen once. So like this will never animate back. It's not on hover. It's just a one-time thing on page load, and that's it. Okay. So yeah, that's a very cool thing. Yeah, if you haven't played around with that, the options are pretty awesome with that. And again, remember, always check out the tooltips. There's some really cool stuff in some of them. So parent class has some. There's also you can target, if you see here, you can target touch and no dash touch. So if you want to target a touch device or a non-touch device, you can use those classes as well. Cool.